The original film adaptation of Pet Sematary is, for some, considered a horror classic, while many others don't look back on the movie quite so fondly. And while the film falls short in some respects, it manages to effectively follow the threads of what I consider to be the most important themes from King's novel. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. I'm back in my Church the Cat costume. Just a 40-year-old man in a low-effort cat costume. High-concept art, folks. This is the second video in the Pet Sematary series in which I will be discussing the 1989 feature-length film adaptation of Pet Sematary. The first video in this series was, of course, about the 1983 novel, and in the weeks to come I'll be taking a look at the sequel to this movie, Pet Sematary 2, which was released in 1992 and is not technically a Stephen King movie, as well as the 2019 movie remake, which I have mixed feelings about. History and background. When Pet Sematary was adapted for film for the first time in 1989, King himself wrote the screenplay, and he made sure the dark themes and musings on death made their way onto the screen. And while the movie doesn't succeed on every level, it predominantly delivers where it really counts on a visceral, emotional level. There is an interesting and thorough documentary about the making of the movie available to watch for free right here on YouTube, so rather than recap everything that went into making the film, I encourage you to check out the documentary for yourself. The documentary is entitled Unearthed and Untold: The Path to Pet Sematary, and I've left a link in the description for anyone interested in the production. Before I move on to the heavier subject matter found within the book and the movie, let's talk about some highlights and some shortcomings of the movie itself. Highlights. While King's screenplay does make some changes and deviates from the novel on occasion, the themes, tone, and majority of the original story remain intact within the movie. Some characters are omitted or their trajectories are altered, but it doesn't have any substantial or negative effect on the movie. The movie was well cast, and while no one performance is remarkably bad, there is one obvious standout performance. I am, of course, referring to Fred Gwynne, who plays Judd Crandall, and Gwynne is simply iconic in this role. When I read the book for the first time, despite having not yet watched the movie, I was already unable to envision Judd Crandall as anyone other than Fred Gwynne. His performance had permeated popular culture to such an extent that I somehow couldn't help but imagine Crandall as Gwynne, regardless of having never seen it. That itself is a testament to Gwynne's performance. The soundtrack and score by Elliot Goldenthal is well done. There are a few instances that begin with string arrangements that initially sound lighthearted and whimsical, and then they subtly morph into something sinister, building up over time into an intense crescendo. There are some more generic droning synth sounds and ambient swells of noise to set the mood, but they are effective, even if not exactly innovative. On the opposite end of the spectrum are the Ramones tunes that were used in the film, including Sheena is a Punk Rocker and the track written specifically for the film entitled Pet Sematary. Both are rockin' tunes. The camera work, particularly in the scene where Baby Gage gets smeared by a truck, is interesting and inventive, and some of the special effects are pretty good. The makeup and practical effects in particular don't feel laughably dated or poorly executed, except shortcomings. Except for when they do feel very dated and laughable. Specifically, the evil Gage stuff that happens toward the end of the movie. There are some shots where Gage is very obviously a doll, and at no point is Gage actually scary or intimidating. In fact, he looks pretty good for a kid who was obliterated by a tanker truck, buried, and returned from the land of the dead. The most hilarious part was when Evil Gage dives out of the attic hatch to attack Lewis, and the two then tangle on the upstairs landing. I was actually laughing out loud at this point in the film, which was definitely not the filmmaker's intended response. And, that's it, really. There are a few other mild criticisms one could make, but for me, the hilarious Evil Gage scenes were the only instances in the film that took me out of the movie. Now it's time to discuss the very heavy themes and subject matter that make up the bulk of both the book and this movie. Dealing in death. I had originally intended to discuss this topic in my video for the novel, but by the time I finished ranting about culturally insensitive youth groups and woodland cannibal demons, the video was already long and incoherent enough. So while this segment was initially intended as a reflection on the book, it is no less relevant in relation to the movie. As is the case with the majority of King stories, beyond the supernatural horror themes of the story is a more relatable human undercurrent. Pet Sematary, the novel as well as the film adaptation, are of course no exception. A great deal of Pet Sematary focuses on how we approach the topic of death and deal with the loss of a loved one. King dwells on whether there is a right or wrong way to talk to children about death, how we introduce them to the concept and to the reality that we and everyone we love will someday cease to exist. Additionally, King writes about how traumatic experiences with death can shape our ability to cope with and come to terms with its inevitability, regardless of the fact that it's a natural occurrence that will someday come for us all. We all experience and are affected by death in our own deeply personal way, and King approaches this topic from a number of angles within the story. Whether it's the death of the beloved family pet, the horrifying death of a stranger at the hands of a tragic accident, family members' prolonged suffering at the hands of crippling disease, a parent witnessing the untimely death of their child. King explores the institution of death and dying and puts its effects on those left to carry on in its wake under a microscope. And no one who reads or watches Pet Sematary has not experienced at least one of these many forms in which life is extinguished. We bear witness and are left in various states of disbelief, shock, and anguish, desperate to pick up the pieces, often unable to entirely overcome or fully withstand the mental consequences these experiences can have on us. Our experience with and relationship to death can permanently change us, and in Pet Sematary, King leaves no stone unturned when it comes to the ways in which his characters experience and are impacted by it. Someone falls victim to a sudden, violent, unexpected incident that instills a deep fear of unpredictability of death in the innocent bystanders. It shocks and bewilders their minds. Life abruptly ended without a moment's notice. In other instances, they watch someone they love struggle and suffer for weeks, months, and years, and they feel a shameful sense of relief when their pain is finally over. Life is slowly extinguished, smothered like a fire being gradually deprived of oxygen. Regardless of the speed with which it comes or what form it takes, these are the experiences that shape the relationships of the characters within the story, as well as our own relationships with and to death. And these influences, these memories that stay with us for the rest of our lives, can have devastating effects on our willingness to accept and grapple with the reality of death. In Pet Sematary, King explores the fact that death is somehow unpredictable yet unavoidable, how we know it will come and yet we may be resilient to the idea or unwilling to accept it. That acceptance is often the most difficult part of the grieving process, coming to grips with the fact that they're gone, and bringing them back just isn't an option. Or in the case of Pet Sematary, it's, at the very least, not a very wise idea to try. Final thoughts. Pet Sematary is a fun movie. Well, fun may not be the right word. I don't know. Enjoyable may be at least closer. The film maintains the tone and themes of the book while reserving its slip-ups and blunders for the final quarter of the movie. So while it's by no means a perfect movie, it's not floating among the worst of the 80s King adaptations in what I consider to be a pretty big cesspool. Next week, I'll be looking at the 1992 sequel to this film, Pet Sematary 2. The original story and screenplay were not written by Stephen King, so it's probably going to be real bad. And as a result, I'm likely going to be forced to make another angry rant video about a greasy wad of curdled wombat shit. But I'm planning to avoid taking that approach this time around and giving the movie a chance to justify its existence. New videos drop every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so snap into a Slim Jim and click the subscriber bell to get notifications. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.